After radical Islamic terrorists struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, George W. Bush, the new 43rd President of the United States, swung into action. His every thought was about keeping America safe. Supported by a highly experienced team consisting of Vice President Dick Cheney.
So notice just the vagueness of calling it the war on terror. It's not a war against like a specific country. It's not a war against a specific like group. It's just against like an idea, right? And so that gives the US a lot of flexibility on where and how it acts, something that she doesn't really highlight here.
Secretary of State Colin Powell, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Bush, himself a former Texas Air National Guard fighter pilot, declared a war on terror. The real-life villain was Osama bin Laden, the leader of the Islamic terrorist group al-Qaeda and the mastermind of the 9/11 attack. Bush emphasized that he would make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. This put Afghanistan's Taliban regime, which had given al-Qaeda safe haven, in the crosshairs. In October 2001, Bush ordered military action in Afghanistan. Within 2 months, the Taliban was overthrown.
It's important to note that the Taliban, they had floated the idea of a trial in a third-party country, and the Bush administration refused this. So the U.S. said only unconditional surrender was acceptable, and they claimed that if they were not going to have unconditional surrender of bin Laden, that they were guilty. Critics at the time, they argued it wasn't just about justice, but also the United States looking for a reason to be able to remove the Taliban and to give the U.S. a strong foothold for military in that region. Okay, now there's some historians who even say that it might have been related to Afghanistan and them being the largest opium producer. So there were critics that argued that the U.S., they wanted to control the opium trade. There's some historians who say that that is not the most substantiated claim. Okay, but anyway, they had offered to give Osama bin Laden up for basically a trial in a third-party country, and PragerU does not acknowledge that here.
Replaced by a new government friendly to the United States. Osama bin Laden, however, evaded capture. Bush could have ended it there, but he worried that...
Okay, so notice she says that his only concern was keeping America safe. So there's going to be others that highlight the idea of oil money.
A new attack, perhaps of even greater magnitude, was inevitable. The main source of his fear was Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq and longtime sponsor of terrorism. With a history of violating UN resolutions and fierce antagonism to the U.S., Hussein boasted about his nuclear weapons program. The CIA and Great Britain's MI6 insisted it wasn't a bluff. The United States, Bush argued, couldn't wait for threats to fully materialize. He declared that if Iraq did not abandon its weapons of mass destruction, America would act. When Hussein ignored him, Bush, with the support of both Republicans and Democrats, made good on his warning. In March,
and so what she doesn't mention in the video is the fact that the U.S. intelligence hadn't proved at that point that Iraq had nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons programs. There were UN weapons inspectors who were still in Iraq in early 2003, and they had not found conclusive evidence at that point. There were some people pushing the notion that premature invasion, that it would undermine inspections and international legitimacy of the United States. Also, people were pointing out that Iraq did not have operational connections to the September 11th attacks, and that Saddam Hussein was a secular leader, while al-Qaeda is more of an Islamic fundamentalist group, making a partnership between someone who's hyper-religious and someone who's more secular unlikely. And then there was also those that argued that the Bush administration, they were intentionally trying to conflate Iraq with the broader war on terror to build support, and that they were trying to essentially fuse 9/11 and Iraq in the public mind in an opportunistic way.
2003, U.S.-led forces invaded Iraq. Within 1 month, Hussein was gone, and within 2 months, Bush stood on the deck of an aircraft carrier in front of a banner that declared, "Mission accomplished." Bush looked like a bold, decisive leader prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect the homeland. Voters rewarded him with a victory over the Democratic candidate, Massachusetts Senator John Kerry, in the 2004 presidential election. As Bush's second term began, however, the situation in Iraq deteriorated. The original plan to depose Hussein had morphed into a plan to remake the country into the first Arab democracy. The idea, the thinking went, was that if Iraq could become democratic.
And so early on, the Bush administration, they tried to justify Iraq by warning about weapons of mass destruction. When those weapons didn't turn up, then they shift the narrative to say that it was about making basically a democracy in an Arab country. Okay, and that brings up the question, can democracy really be brought about by a foreign country, by a foreign power? And as this is going on, you have scandals like Abu Ghraib, where U.S. soldiers were abusing Iraqi prisoners, essentially torturing them, and this undercut the very idea of what America said it was spreading. So these contradictions made a lot of people question the Bush narrative and if it really was about democracy.
Other Arab countries would follow. America hastily organized a Western-style election, but Iraqis' tribal hatred for each other soon erupted. The U.S. was caught in the crossfire. American casualties mounted monthly, and the American public soured both on the war and on the president they had recently re-elected. Bush's problems were compounded when, after an extensive search, no weapons of mass destruction were found, undermining the rationale for the invasion.
And so the video notes that they never found the weapons of mass destruction. But what's important for us to focus on is the media framing at that time. There were major media outlets that just kept repeating the administration's claims constantly that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and that Saddam had stockpiles of these weapons. People who questioned this narrative, they were often labeled as unpatriotic, even anti-American. And so in that environment, skepticism wasn't treated as healthy, but it was treated as disloyalty. So this climate of pressure and fear, it meant that the weapons of mass destruction narrative really went unchallenged. And that's something that Prager doesn't know. They just casually note at the end that the weapons of mass destruction weren't found without highlighting the way that people were bullied into accepting that narrative.
Things went from bad to worse in August 2005. A massive hurricane, Katrina, devastated New Orleans, killing over 1,000 people and destroying billions of dollars in property. The media blamed Bush. A photo of the president looking down on the city from Air Force One, rather than being on the ground with those suffering, became the disaster's defining image. That Bush couldn't control the weather and was not responsible for the city's inadequate infrastructure was ignored. When things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, they did. In late 2007, the country was hit with a major financial crisis. Once again, Bush took the blame for something for which he was not responsible. For a decade, government policies, begun in the Clinton administration, encouraged banks to throw out the traditional lending standards by which they measured a home buyer's creditworthiness. By the early 2000s, one could buy a home without making any down payment at all, something unheard of in previous generations. By the late 2000s, the bubble was ready to burst. When Bush refused to bail out Lehman Brothers, a legendary Wall Street banking firm enmeshed in home loans, it did. Against his free market instincts, Bush committed $700 billion to rescue the mortgage industry, an act some say saved the economy, but left Main Street angry that it was footing the bill for an irresponsible Wall Street. Bush's approval rating fell to a dismal 25%. Yet amid all these setbacks, Bush did something quite extraordinary, an act of true courage. When almost all his advisors, both military and political, told him to cut his losses and accept defeat in Iraq, he refused. He believed that such an action would irreparably damage both America's security.
And so in the video, they frame it in a positive light that Bush went against his advisors and basically had the troops stay in Iraq, right? But with that, there's the other side that it basically dragged out U.S. occupation there and that there were a lot of troops involved that didn't need to be, and that this cost more American lives and also billions of dollars and Iraqi lives on top of that. And so it basically kept the U.S. stuck without a clear exit plan. Notice Prager, they try to frame usually everything that Democrats do as negative, which I strongly disagree with Clinton's policies concerning like deregulating the financial institutions, but they generally try to frame everything that Republicans do as positive and everything that Democrats do as negative when it's a lot more nuanced than that. When there have been Republican policies that were awful. Yes, there have been Democrat policies that were bad, but they've had bad Republican policies that Prager usually tries to frame in a positive light.
And credibility with its allies. Rather than drawing down forces, he decided in January 2007 to increase them, a strategy that came to be known as the surge. It worked. By the following year, American casualties had dramatically diminished. When he handed the presidency over to his successor, Barack Obama, there was a clear path forward for both Iraq and the U.S. economy. It was an impossibly difficult 2 terms, but Bush could point to one undeniable fact. After 9/11, there had not been another such attack on American soil. I'm Elizabeth Spaulding, Senior Fellow at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy and Chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for Prager University.
Okay, so it's true that the 2007 surge in Iraq, that did lead to fewer American casualties, but also we have to ask at what cost. The surge extended the war, it increased Iraq's dependency on U.S. troops, and it didn't resolve the underlying divisions between the Sunni and Shiite groups. Okay, the video also highlights as a success that there were no other major terrorist attacks on U.S. soil after 9/11. We have to ask if that's more about the Iraq war and going in and basically invading Iraq, or if that's more about increased security measures domestically within the U.S. It seems like they're grasping at straws to try to paint Bush and Republicans in general in a better light. So there's many critics who claim that the Iraq war increased more extremism abroad, that it created new groups like ISIS, and that's something that they don't really dive into within the video.
Thanks for watching. For more videos on history, politics, history education, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm finishing up my PhD right now with a focus on history education. And so this is a channel where you're going to be able to get a lot of that. Thanks for the support.